Hey there guys. Okay, I'm going to do a fly today that is a synthetic version of a pink thing or a chartreuse thing or whatever you want to call it thing. But the idea of it being synthetic means you don't have hackle feathers that get snapped off when you get something that's got a decent set of teeth on it, like a mackerel or even a tailor. Also even fishing for things like kingfish or whatever, you need a fly that's going to stand up to, more than one fish. So let me just quickly run through the materials that I'm using. So instead of hackle feathers for the tail, I'm using some EP fibre. This one's called Minnow Body. It's just plain white. So that'll be what I create the tapered tail that would normally be a hackle feather. Then I'm just using various colours of flash material, whatever you've got. So since I'm doing chartreuse and white, I've got a sort of a light olive colour for over the back, pearl for underneath, and this will form the lateral line down the EP fibre. A bit of hackle. So in this case I'm using some chartreuse grizzly hackle. And then the head, that again is normally either schlappen or a hackle feather that's just palmed around the hook. I'm using this stuff called baitfish emulator flash. If you see, it's just like a long ribbon, but it's flash synthetic material, so you can wrap the hook with it the same as you would when you were palmering. Other than that, I'm going to use some lead on the shank. A little bit of epoxy, and I'm going to use one of the Flyman fish masks to finish the fly off. I'll show you that when we get to that point. So let me just lay down a layer of thread and then put the lead on, and we'll continue from there. Okay, so I've got the thread on. I'm just using a chartreuse thread. This is a 6/0, but really you could use anything flat wax, whatever is going to work. Okay, so the next step is to put a layer of lead onto the hook. So the lead I'm using is this. Okay, so it's a 0.030, so a fairly thick lead. And it really is just to give it a little bit of weight, just to take it down under the surface a little bit. You could fish it on a floating line or a sinking line. Originally when I tied this, I was tying it for mackerel and sharks, so you want it to get down under the surface a little bit. When you're fishing for things like Spanish mackerel up in the tropics, you actually use a fast sink line, because quite often they'll be down deep feeding on bait fish. I know, when they're fishing them on lures, they quite often troll for them and get them up on the surface, but it's a matter of getting them up on the surface. So this, at least with a little bit of weight, gives you some flexibility, I guess, in letting the fly sink a bit quicker. Okay, so that's the lead. Just put a few wraps of thread over it just to stop it moving up and down the shank. So the next stage is to take the EP fibre. Now, do this in 2 lots, and the reason being, as I'll show you, you actually want to tie it on top of each other rather than doing a tail that is wide. You want one that is high and thin, like a hackle feather. So that's the reason for tying it in 2 steps rather than just doing one big fat round sort of tail, which is fine if you want a really bulky fly, but we want to have a tail that's that mimics what a deceiver tail would look like. So I'm just tapering the ends of the material, and a lot of you have seen me do that before, just to try and get that sort of natural taper into it. And then I'm folding it in half, and I'm just going to cut that like so, and then bring these 2 together. Alright, so now we've just basically got a piece that's tapered a bit like a deceiver tail. So measure it up where you want this to sit, and we're going to tie it in just behind that lead. Alright, so I might need to zoom out a little bit just so you can see the whole tail there. Alright, so this is a 4/0 hook, so I'm doing round about 2 hook lengths back, just to give it a little bit of tail and you know, again give it some movement. So as I'm tying it in, I'm squeezing the material between my thumb and finger, again just to try and keep it so it sits up straight. So you can see there I've got it long that way and thin that way. Alright, so then cut off the excess fairly close to the lead wire. We'll wrap our thread up, and then we're just going to repeat that again. So we're just going to take another piece of the EP fibre and taper it and get that ready to tie in. Alright, so we'll cut that off. So at the moment it's just straight. I'm just going to roll it between my fingers and taper it at the same time. And then we get a nice point at each end. It's a bit hard sometimes with some of this synthetic material because it tends to knot rather than just slide up and down on itself. So again, we get it, we cut it in half, and then I roll it, and that sort of brings it together. Alright, so there you can see again, I've got a tapered end. Alright, so just before we do that, because we're doing it in 2 lots, it allows us to also do a lateral line, which you don't get if you use a deceiver. Obviously you can't run flash up the middle of the feather, so at least this way we can put some flash in and just give it something a little bit extra. So flash, just fold it over the thread, drop it up on top of the hook shank. Try not to let go of it like I just did. Alright, so we're holding it up there and tie that in. Get it to about the length you want. Now for these sorts of patterns I let it slip out a little bit past the end of the hook. Just gives it a little bit more flash. Alright. So that, then we take the other piece of tapered material and again we measure it up, squeeze it between the thumb and finger so it's narrow, not round, and then tie that in, same as we did the last piece. Alright, so if you look there now, you've got like a deceiver tail, thin that way, thick that way, hey? So that's called, basically that's a high tie method, where you just stack it on top of the previous piece. So things like polar fibre minnows, a lot of the bunker type patterns that they use in the US, herring patterns, that sort of stuff, are this high tie method of tying. So it just allows you to build it up on top but keep a thin bait fish like profile, but have a wider body. So you could imagine if you just tied that straight up the front, put a set of eyes on it, a little bit of epoxy over the eyes, you've got you know, a fairly decent looking bait fish pattern for most fish. Okay, so now that I've put the thread back through after breaking it, cut that bit off. Alright, so the next step is to now do a little bit of flash over there across the top, and then I'm just going to tie in a little bit of streamer hair, and the streamer hair goes in place of where we would do the bucktail in a standard pink thing or deceiver pattern, but you don't need a hell of a lot. So first thing is just to tie in some crystal flash. So as I said, I'm just going to use like a light olivey colour for the back, and that just sort of gives it a little bit of a colour change between the back and the belly of the fly. So same thing, wrap it up over your thread, pull it back, make sure it's sitting nicely on top, tie that in like so. Okay, and then same underneath, so for the belly. So for the belly of this fly, I'm just using ordinary everyday pearl. You can use UV pearl. UV colours are actually quite a good one for kingfish. So if you're tying something specific for kingfish, maybe use some UV flash instead of just the standard colours. Whatever you've got basically will work. Alright, so we want this either side of the hook just to make sure it's fairly even. So we tie that in, bring it back over itself, and a couple of wraps. Alright, so at this point I also suggest that you put some head cement on it, just to give it a little bit of strength and to stop the white synthetic fibre pulling out of the tail. Alright, so that's one of the things I suggest. So let me just do that and then we'll come back. Okay, so now we're just going to tie the streamer hair in. So what I've done is just taken the streamer hair again, just sort of tapered it. So you've got nice tapered edges. So the first piece I'm just going to tie in on the underside here. And you'll see I'm slowly moving up the hook with each thing I add. So that's another important thing. So just tie that one down. Like so. Alright. And then what I'm going to do is just put a little bit of streamer hair, the white colour streamer hair, either side of the hook. Okay, so another piece here. Actually, we've got to tie in the hackle feather first, and then we'll put that on. So you'll get our hackle feathers, and you want to get 2 hackle feathers that are roughly the same. Okay, so find 2 that are about the same size, pull them off. Okay, so there's one. And what we're going to do is we're just going to measure it to the tail of the fly. Alright, so that's there. And now what we're going to do is we're just going to strip off these fibres towards the front here. If you can see that, I've stripped the fibres off. And then just take a pair of scissors, cut those. So now the trick is, a lot of people have trouble getting the hackle feather to sit on straight, so when you tie it, it doesn't sort of curve up, because you want it to be flat, and sometimes when you tie it, it tends to curve up. So what I do is I turn the fly onto its side, so you can sit the feather onto the fly, right, and hold it in place with your thumb. Do a couple of loose wraps to start off with, just to hold the feather in place, and then wrap up a little bit further, and you'll see that's sitting straight. Okay, so that's the first one in. Again, just take your thread up, make sure it's not going to come out. Turn it over, get your second feather. Again, measure it up so that it's going to the tips of the tail. Alright, to there. And just strip off some of the feather, because it becomes a lot easier to tie in when you haven't got all those little hackle bits hanging around. And lay that flat on top again, like so. Hold it in place, couple of loose wraps around that, and then firm it up as you get back towards the feather itself. And again, that's sitting nice and flat. Okay, cut off the excess tips. Now we can continue with the super hair, streamer hair, super hair, whatever you want to call it. Okay, so we're just going to tie a little bit of this in on either side. Again, this is what you normally put bucktail on for. So cut off the excess. The other bit on this side. And again, this just helps hold everything in place and gives a little bit more bulk to the sides. One of the things we're trying to do with this fly, obviously, with putting this baitfish emulator on it, or if you were doing a traditional version, a palmed hackle feather, or in some cases people use crosscut rabbit. The whole purpose of that basically is to make it push water, give it a little bit of movement at the front, make it look like flared gills, but really you get this nice round head on the fly, which really does look like you know, a bait fish from the front, but it really pushes water and makes a disturbance, and that's what the fish are picking up on. Okay, so that's it with all the streamer hair on it now. So we've got streamer hair on the bottom, both sides, and a little bit of chartreuse streamer hair over the top. Now that'll go translucent in the water, but it's a bit stiffer than, yeah, unique hair is fairly good too, but it's not as stiff as streamer hair. So if you've got streamer hair, use that. If you haven't, just use unique hair. Alright, the next bit now is to tie in the baitfish emulator flash. Now, we want that going back that way, obviously. So we're going to tie it in on the side, and then we just wrap it back over itself. So tie it in, and then we take the thread to the front, and then it's just a matter of wrapping the same as you would if you were palmering a feather, just wrapping it around the hook. Now, because we're going to use one of these fish masks, we need to leave a little bit of space at the front. So just make sure you don't wrap this all the way to the eye of the hook. So about there's as much as we're going to need. Alright, so we'll take our thread, catch that in, and again, just to make sure it's not going to come off, and then carefully cut it off, trying not to cut the thread. Now any flash material that's pushed forward, you just hold it back with your fingers and run your thread back over it like that, and hopefully your thread won't snap like mine keeps doing. Now again, because we're putting a fish mask on, we don't need to be too pretty, because you're not going to see whatever you've done up here. So just whip finish it like that. Any bits that have sort of coming too far forward, you can cut off. Okay, so there's the body of the fly done. Now the next step is to put the fish mask on it. Okay, so that's a fish mask there. A packet of them like that. Of course, you can build up the head, stick some eyes on, and then epoxy it. Completely up to what you want to do. So the idea with the fish mask is you just put it on like that. Alright, so you see that, and that's that finishes the fly off. You just stick the eyes onto the fish mask. Now, a little trick, a lot of people glue their fish masks on, which you can do. One of the little tricks I have learned is if you run some UV epoxy under the fish mask, it dries perfectly clear, but you can set it still with the torch because the fish mask is clear. So the UV light still travels through the fish mask and sets the epoxy, and basically then you've got your head epoxied onto the body. So it's very unlikely that it's going to spin, and very unlikely that it's going to come off. So that's what I'm doing now, just putting a little bit of UV epoxy on there. Then we put the fish mask over it like that. Okay, I'll just take a quick look and make sure that the fish mask is on straight with the hook. Looks pretty good. Alright, so that's it, the fish mask's on, the epoxy's underneath it. As soon as I hit it with this torch, that's it. It's going to be set hard as a rock, so it won't come off. But I still wrap the eye of the hook. So if you see there, I'm pushing that's not going to move. Okay, so the next bit is to wrap the eye of the hook, which I do, and I just use mono thread, so mono thread there, and then stick some eyes on, so I'll come back and do that. Okay, so there the eyes in place. Now I'm just doing this little bit of mono here at the front, and again that's just to stop the fish mask being able to come off the eye of the hook. Alright, so that'll hold that in place, and then just a little bit of head cement just on that mono wrap, and that'll sink into the mono and stop that coming undone. So that's pretty much it. That's the fly finished. Now if you've got bits flying around all over the place and you're not happy with that, by all means feel free to trim it, but I personally don't think there's a need to trim it. It's pretty good as it is. Once you wet it, of course, it's all going to slip back anyway. But that's it, finished. So that's it from the side. If you look from the top, you've got that narrow tail, but plenty of bulk up here. Okay. If you look at it now from the front, you'll see what I mean about the profile of the fly. So it widens out here, so that's going to push a lot of water, as will that head, because it's a solid head. All right. Yet the tail with the hackle and that fibre that I've used, you're going to get that same motion as you would for a deceiver. So that's it, guys. Go and give that one a try. Fairly easy to tie once you've got the hang of it, and probably one that'll work well on anything from kingfish to cod to mackerel to any of those pelagic species. And you can do it in all different sizes, obviously, depending on the materials that you've got. But the good thing about using synthetic is basically you could tie a fly as long as the piece of material you've got. So you could use the full length of that and make some pretty big flies. So that's what makes this pattern a pretty good all-rounder. Anyway, enjoy.